Hey Emma,
Yes, Valen.
what do you call the new game that's coming out? It's a sequel to a long-running franchise that takes place deep underground. It is about the perils of settler colonialism, except it's kind of everybody's fault when you think about it.
I don't know. What do you call it?
Bioshock Negative Infinity. Hello and welcome to Talk This.
It's dangerous to podcast alone.
I didn't have any good ideas this week. I'm sorry. In a different multiverse, maybe I had better ideas. Host Madelyn.
I'm your other multiverse host, Emma.
And thanks for tuning in to this week's show. This week, we're talking Bioshock Infinite, and we're talking Redfall. I feel like you've been picking games with interesting parallels lately, or maybe just all games you can find similarities and differences between them.
You know, we've been doing this long enough that I think we're pretty good at it by now. Maybe. You know, like the Beatles.
Like the Beatles.
You practice a lot and you get good, right? That's the Beatles.
Is that the Beatles?
Didn't they say something about... Or is it Malcolm? Was the example the Beatles in the Malcolm Gladwell book that I read in middle school?
Haven't we all debunked Malcolm Gladwell by now?
If you do something a lot, you probably get better at it. I feel like that's a fundamental truth. That's fine.
I love that it's like, we're the Beatles. Famous two-piece band. The Beatles.
Exactly.
You know what? No, you're right. The Beatles have two important members and two side members.
Right.
By which I refer to our respective roommates.
Uh-huh.
Who am I referring to when I say the two important members and two side people?
Let us know.
Let us know, Beatles fans.
I was gonna say I don't think the Infinite in the Bioshock Infinite title is about the fact that it's high in the sky.
No, it's not, but that's why it's a joke.
Ah, okay. I see.
It is definitely about the fact that there are lots of timelines, but I also thought, it's high up. So what's the opposite of high up? Underground.
Yeah. Got it.
So it's a kind of a high concept.
Underwater, you might say.
No. That's Bioshock. I know what Bioshock is about. Even below that, below the water.
I think we have talked about the first Bioshock before on the show.
I'm sure that we have, and I couldn't remember if it was in the context of it. I think it was an actual game.
Yes, I think it's one of our earlier ones, actually.
But we also definitely talked about Bioshock Infinite a little bit before in our Religion and Games episode.
Right, that makes sense.
Or history, and it may have come up in several episodes. We've talked about Bioshock Infinite before.
I probably played some of Bioshock Infinite. I don't know if that was before we were doing the show, though. It was certainly before we were doing the 6 weeks, but...
Guess what, though? I was sure that Bioshock Infinite was on the PS3, and it's not.
Is it... Do you have the disc for it?
I didn't think so. I don't think I do.
I definitely played it on the PS3.
Well... also, the PS3 runs great still, by the way, in case anyone's wondering on the relative health of my PlayStations. PS3 does still boot up. The controllers are screwed to all hell. I'm like trying to, this is going to sound subliminal, but I swear it wasn't. I turn on, I promise I'll talk about the games, listeners. I'm sorry. It's Madeline Story Hour. Listen to me. But I'm like, the controller's drifting, it's going all over the place, the inputs aren't working right, which is not that surprising because the joysticks have taken on a permanently slightly sticky, slightly greasy feel that I think is
that sort of always happened to PS3 controllers, from what I remembered.
Yeah. And so, through no fault of my own, it began to download Yakuza Dead Souls, which I had purchased, but not downloaded. I swear I didn't do it. I swear that I didn't tell it to do it. But then I couldn't make it stop. Like, it was like, you can't turn off the PlayStation. I kept trying to make it go back to the menu. It was like X in the corner. So I had to let it download. So now it's downloaded, but
it said play a better game.
So, listeners, I apologize. I did not play either of the games this week because I feel like I've read enough about Bioshock Infinite that I get it.
Sure.
And
I've played Bioshock Infinite, some of it.
So you're holding down the fort. And I was not going to spend... I'm sure Redfall isn't $70 anymore, surely, right? But I was not going to spend $70 on Redfall. Also, I don't have an Xbox.
Also, you can't.
Yep.
Yeah.
I was not going to spend $70 on it
do you want to know?
Be able to play it.
Do you want to know when I quit Bioshock Infinite?
With the stoning?
Fun story to... No. I at least met Elizabeth and such. But there was a part where you had to kill everybody in the area to proceed. And I could not find the last guy. I could hear him. But he was not anywhere. So I started riding around. Booker has this, like, arm thing that he can ride around on, like, the rails that are around this floating city. Mm-hmm. And so I was just going in a circle around that, and he was, like, glitched out on a roof way away from me. And so I had to keep riding the rails, and there was just, like, a small period of time where I could even try to shoot this guy so that I could kill him, so I could proceed with the level. Like, maybe I could have reloaded, but that did not occur to me at the time.
Yeah.
And I didn't want to do it again, also. And then I got really violently motion sick, going around and around on those rails in first person, and so I stopped, and then I didn't pick it up again.
And
that's why I didn't finish Bioshock Infinite.
Do you feel like that's a metaphor for the American dream?
You know what? Sure. Yeah. Actually, you're right.
One guy glitches himself to the roof, and the rest of us just go around and around and around to get motion sick.
Yeah. Yeah. Those brilliant people at Irrational Games, they got me.
They gotcha. Anyway, Bioshock Infinite, if you haven't heard of it, or if you didn't hear us talk about it, I'm pretty sure it had to have come up when we talked about religion in games, because it
for sure
is definitely like one of the religion in games.
Yes.
Is a role-playing first-person shooter from Irrational Games, published by 2K, came out in 2013 originally for the Xbox 360, PS3, and computers. You can now play it on various platforms, including the Nintendo Switch. Along with
wow, like is it native on the Nintendo Switch, or is it a cloud version?
As far as I know. Yeah, there's a whole collection.
Cool.
No, my boyfriend considered downloading that and didn't. I was going to feel very stupid if we had that. He thought about it, but he did not.
Okay. Got it.
Anyway, Bioshock Infinite is set in an alternate year, 1912. It's in a sort of a floating airborne city. That's what floating means. Called Columbia. And you play as Booker DeWitt, who comes there to rescue Elizabeth from the Songbird and the evil people in Columbia, because she's got a magic ability, basically, to manipulate tears in the space-time continuum, and that's valuable.
Yeah, specifically, Booker's not really there to rescue her. He's there to kidnap her, basically. Sure. And deliver her to people in order to, basically, like, the note you keep seeing is, like, give us the girl and we'll wipe away the debt, essentially. So essentially, he's sort of kidnapping her to bring her to people so that some mysterious debt that he has will be, forgiven, essentially. But Elizabeth is sort of into it because, she's been kept in this tower her whole life, and she really wants to get out and see the world and see Paris, somewhat specifically. So just, he's not really here to rescue her, just as like a small framing shift.
Sorry, you're right. I meant like, there's a positive element to her.
Yes.
But yes. Fair clarification. Anyway, yeah, Columbia is this like alternate hyper-American city, essentially, founded by Comstock. That basically, like, the developers were very inspired by the World's Fair, and specifically by the Chicago World's Fair of 1893. And so, in this alternate universe, the U.S., like, funded this floating city, but then, because of tensions around the Boxer Rebellion, which I know you remember from history class, don't ya? They kind of broke apart, they seceded, and Columbia becomes this, like, theocracy centered around worshipping the founding fathers.
Yes.
Which, look, I think we're going to say a lot about the actual politics and actual statements of this game, but you do have to give it to them that, like, who else has done something like this?
Oh, for sure. They were swinging for the fences. I actually came out of this research more sympathetic towards this game than I was initially. So, there's that.
What do you mean by that? What made you more sympathetic?
Just reading about, I hadn't realized how much how much of a mess development was.
Oh yeah.
And exactly how much stuff that they had made that didn't end up in the game. Because Bioshock Infinite in its end result feels like it has a ton of ideas that it simply does not explore, right? And you wonder, Ken Levine said he thinks they left 2 to 3 games worth of content on the cutting room floor. One of the art directors said 5 or 6 games worth of content was cut from Bioshock Infinite over the course of its development. So you wonder how much you wonder how much of it is a lack of understanding, and you wonder how much of it is just the fact that they added these things and then were planning to follow up on them probably at some point, but ended up not being able to do that because of its haphazard approach to development until the publisher sent in a cleanup guy to get it out.
Yeah, I hate to say that, because this is just true any 2 games you pick, right? But I hate to say that one of the things that stood out to me this week of similarities between the 2 games was, a messy development process in which a lot of ideas were there, right? But definitely something that I think is an interesting parallel between these 2 games, especially given the quite different critical response. I think that it's something, speaking to something about the ineffable of that swinging for the fences energy, that you can have a game like Bioshock where you can kind of see oh yeah, here's all the skeletons of all this stuff that they cut, and still I think Bioshock Infinite's legacy is different than its critical response at the time, certainly.
Yes.
But was very well reviewed at the time, and still is a game that people talk about and is beloved by many people. And even if it's not, you sort of have to respect they were going for something here energy of it. Whereas when we talk about Redfall, I think it will be not that, mostly.
In some ways it feels like opposite problems in a way of this, they had too much freedom for too long, basically, and by the time they sent people in, it was maybe too late, that they should have gotten I watched an interview with Ken Levine, a recent one, and he was not good at management.
Yeah.
Right? I will tell you that in the interviews I read, there's an excerpt from Jason Schreier's book, the Press Reset one on Polygon, where one of the other people was he'll be the first one to tell you he's not good at managing people. And they should have given him someone earlier to help him manage people. So it was they had too much freedom and then were very imposed upon in the last year of development. Whereas Redfall, we'll see, they sort of had stuff imposed upon them from ZeniMax. And then when they were bought by Xbox was way too hands-off with them when they were still working on Redfall. So it's they have a sort of an opposite problem, even if there is parallels in that development process.
And it was interesting, Ken Levine obviously is a sort of a singular figure in games.
Yeah.
And is the the head of the studio here, the founder of the studio, one of the founders of the studio. And it was interesting to me, and maybe some of it is just that it was a different time, right? But when you read these, oh my god, this was a development nightmare story, usually, in a lot of our podcast games lately, it's been oh, this guy was abusive. And here it seems everyone was crunching a lot, and that was really bad. But they seemed like reasonably chill about it in the way they talk
Yeah,
about
I
it.
was surprised by how much I read that's like, it's clear that he's not an easy person to work with, but not in a way where, like, some of the other guys that we've talked about. He's not, at least so far, as far as I can tell, there are no accusations against him in terms of, like, actual, like abusive or criminal behavior. He's just, like, he's not very good at managing people, and that causes problems if you're a game director, seemingly with no, like, producer oversight for several years.
Yeah, but even in these interviews, it was striking to me how clear-eyed, I mean, as you said, how clear-eyed he was about that he's not great at it. And the, like, these people are my employees and shouldn't be my friends kind of attitude of it. I was like, okay, that's healthy. That's a healthy boss attitude, I think.
Well, in the interview I watched, and it was, like, going over just, like, the Bioshock history, too. Like, when Irrational Games was dissolved, when Ken Levine made his new one, which I think is Ghost Ship, maybe? And he wanted to go way smaller and work with a much smaller group of people. Like, they had, like, job fairs, they had really good support for the people being let go of Irrational. Like, they kept the company going for a while until they were certain, like, oh, these people will be okay. And then they closed it, which is just, like, in this age of, like, we let you go on the last day of the month so that we don't have to pay you for another month of health insurance, is very nice. I don't know.
No, it feels like, ultimately to me, it feels like when the capital G gamers are like, well, I would love to crunch. Like, what a great thing, working hard. Like, everybody wants to be there because they love the game so much. This did feel like, okay, like, what, like, you know, whatever. I'm in the midst of my, like, work crunch season right now, right? And, like, you know, it sucks. And I don't mean to say, like, crunch is fine. But this feels like when people defend crunch, what they think they're defending is this studio where everybody's like, yeah, they're still getting beer brought in on Fridays, and, like, you know.
I'm sure there were plenty of people who were frustrated.
Oh, absolutely.
I would be frustrated. I was reading some of the stuff of, like they hired one guy to come in before, like, they brought in the closer. Yeah. They hired Don Roy first, who was, like, in 2012, right? So, like, this team didn't make Bioshock 2. They moved from Bioshock basically to Bioshock Infinite. So Bioshock came out, like, 2007, right? There's maybe a little time in between before they started working on it, but not that much. In 2012, they brought this guy in. He's like, can I play a build of the game? And they were like, no.
Yeah.
We don't have one. Just, like, people, like, just, it felt like it's like a production where pre-production and production is somehow happening at the same time forever. Which is like, oh boy, Jesus.
It just feels like true auteur
George Washington
to me.
Excuse
me. Of like this is not managed, but everyone's like, but this guy is really smart. And it just keeps going and going and going and going. It was fascinating. It was fascinating read after several weeks in a row, I feel like, of games where it's like, oh, this man flashed me kind of energy. You know, it's like, okay, like, it's good to read about some good old-fashioned, you're just being overworked by a guy who doesn't understand a deadline kind of workplace fun.
Yeah.
Anyway. And I did love the, like, everyone was like, thank God that the closer guy came in. He was great. That was also fascinating to me, because, again, usually, I researched Redfall and then I researched Bioshock Infinite. It's like, oh, usually when the corporate guy comes in, it's like, get out of here, you see. And here they were like, thank God.
Yeah. Yeah, it was also really interesting in this interview I watched, you know, Ken Levine has just announced his first, like, new game since Bioshock Infinite, which is called Judas. That is new. studio, and he's like, we've been working on it for a while, but we didn't show anything until now because in Bioshock Infinite, like, all of our trailers and promotional trailers are stuff that is not actually in the game. Like, the E3 2011, the stuff they showed there, nothing. There's, like, nothing in there that made it into the final game.
At the same time,
and so he's like, we haven't shown anything so that it can be, like, we're confident about this first. Which is a privilege, I guess, someone like Ken Levine has, but, you know.
At the same time, I read at least a couple of quotes from developers who were like, oh, we were so relieved when stuff got showed in E3 because that meant, like, that had to be the name of the thing now. Like, it had to be Columbia, it had to be Elizabeth, because, like, we showed it, so no more iterating. Yeah.
Elizabeth apparently went through a lot of iteration.
Doesn't surprise me.
When one of her first ones, apparently she was, like, mute.
Oh.
Which is fascinating. Sure. I don't know.
Interesting.
But I read again in this interview, it was a great interview. They went over, like, they made a Liz task force. So they just had people who were dedicated, like, usually you would work on things that overarching the whole game, you know, like animations and models and you know, AI behavior and whatever that stuff. But instead of having them work, like, on stuff that could go across the whole game, they just had them work on Elizabeth. Because they really wanted that, like, it's not like games weren't doing AI companions, right? I mean, just that year, narrative would be invented, right? With The Last of Us and Ellie following you around.
Which one came out first?
But they really wanted but they really wanted Elizabeth to work. Which she did at the time. It's very interesting. There was some quotes about, like, designing her to be, like, helpful, right? And not get in your way, which is so fast. Like, talking about, like, oh, people hate protection missions, you know, it's never fun. And it's you know, I just played the Resident Evil 4 remake this year, and you know what? That's a very fun protection mission. I know people like to meme on the original, but also the original is a classic, so I don't know how true that is. And in fact, the fact that Elizabeth can never get in trouble, is always throwing you stuff, I feel like makes her feel, to me, feel a little fake.
I mean, yeah.
In retrospect. I mean, I know they're all fake, but, like, particularly so.
The alternative is Ellie, like, pushing me out from behind a wall, though. So, I'll take it.
AI, definitely, AI was in its, the AI that governs your companion character was working hard those days, I guess.
Learning.
They were learning.
Anyway, Bioshock Infinite was, like, very much also heralded as a, wow, games can be serious kind of game at the time.
I read actually some very interesting contemporary critiques. There's, like, a big one on Kotaku from, like, Kirk Hamilton.
I think I saw that too.
On, like, like, this game is so violent.
Yes.
That, in fact, like, you know, you open it up and you think, oh, he's like, I can call my sister in, you know? And she can see that, like, games are cool or whatever. And then Booker, like, rips someone's head open with his claw. Oops. And it's like, well, maybe not. I read a few that were like, why does this have to be violent at all? Which, personally, I don't agree with, just based on the way the existing story is. Booker is a very violent person, and that is very important to the story. But I do remember being, like, when the claw went into the guy's head, which was, like, the first thing of, oh my god, it was a lot. It was very much a lot.
Yeah. But I think Bioshock Infinite is also very much a product of this, like, Jon Stewart era. I feel like, and I say that with the the respect toward, I feel like Jon Stewart has done a lot of work in the past few years, especially in kind of breaking himself out of the equal opportunity, everybody's just as fine to laugh at kind of comedy of this era. But that's the sort of, I think, more recent critique of Bioshock Bioshock Infinite that was not as prominent at the time, although I'm sure people were saying it at the time too, is that, we've got Father Comstock, who's your, like, white villain, like, super, super villain, right? We've also got to have Daisy Fitzroy, who is, rising up against him, black woman. And, like, the game sort of says they're both bad.
Yeah. Yeah, most of its, its approach to critiquing the stuff it's critiquing is not that different than the original Bioshock. I just think it's a messier, you can critique Ayn Rand. That's a focused topic, right? That you can do sort of like
That's
this.
a dissertation.
But trying to critique all of American exceptionalism, maybe you had to do a little bit more than what you did in the original Bioshock. And I think most of Bioshock Infinite is just sort of like a little too like strong-fisted, like, yes, racism is bad, and stuff that doesn't really actually matter to the main themes of the game anyway. And so perhaps should have been either brought in more or toned down. I read something that's like, why are there all of these, in this floating city utopia, like, why are there all of these minorities anyway? Why did they bring them here?
Well, they have to have servants. They have to have an underclass, right? But yeah.
I guess so. But Daisy Fitzroy is just an embarrassment of writing, I think. In particular, of, like, setting up this, like, as soon as you meet her, it's like, wow, this lady sucks. I don't know if I've mentioned on the show, but I say it every time this comes up in media, but I just watched the One Piece live action and it did this. I hate the, like, trope of, like, this minority group is, like, right, but they're just too violent about it, Yeah,
it's crazy how historically, contemporarily relevant that can be, isn't it?
Yeah.
So the both sides is I think I don't know that would be have been anyone's intention, like, obvious intention in making it. The obvious intention here is, like, let's poke at American exceptionalism, let's poke at racism, let's poke at, like, religion. And so with all of that, it's obvious that our development team has political opinions which probably lean one direction. But also, man, in 2013 it was cool to be like, centrism is it. And that feels less and less cool in 2023. And frankly, in 2016.
Man, I should have checked this, but I have a vague memory of, like, well, Daisy Fitzroy is killed, like, unceremoniously. Yeah. But I think it's also, like, Elizabeth kills her and, like, does her character development. There's at least definitely a time where Elizabeth kills someone and then puts on, like, a sexy dress and is like, I'm a grown-up now. Nice. Which is not, sure, it's not great.
There's also definitely, like, an edgelord kind of, like, religion thing here. Like, it's sick to drown somebody in a baptismal font. Like, that's, like,
sure, yes.
Dope. Like, great idea. Kind of heavy-handed metaphor, but okay.
I mean, its art direction is great. The ideas behind it are really interesting, like, there's what makes Bioshock Infinite stick in memory, I think, even as, like, critical response has gone in different directions on it, is it has so much you can see, like, that's, like, it's so promising, and yet it just, like, fails those promises as it goes.
It does make you wonder. I mean, obviously this is the kind of, obviously as like no one, you can't point to a game that really does something like this. I mean, I'm sure you can point to plenty of indie games that do something like this, but you can't point to a game on this budget level that does something like this, or that tackles sort of this sort of thing in this sort of way. I don't think.
Yeah.
And
the one thing I saw, like the Wolfenstein series, commits to its Nazis are real bad, but also like examining all of the different ways that Nazis are bad, you know? So there is stuff that dives into like similar sort of subject matter, but not this particular
And
thing.
that's fair. I'll give the kind of themes similarity to Wolfenstein, but what sticks out to me here too is like these guys cracked up in their American history textbooks and were like, how can we craft an alternate, like, this isn't like, I'm not saying this about Wolfenstein exactly, but it's like, okay, like we see plenty of kind of post World War II alt histories.
Yeah, that's fair. The World War II is definitely more well-treaded ground than like the 1910s.
It's just fascinating that they're like, yeah, let's take that part of AP US history that everybody is kind of like burnt out in March, April learning. And like, also it's like random. There's no like famous presidents that you venerated in the pantheon of founders during this period. So like, what's even going on in 1893, you know? Kind of era. It's I appreciate the bold alt history reimagining, because I feel like alternate histories can start to feel a little samey, and that's something that sticks out to me too. Here is there's like a clear vision of let's create a world, and then ultimately the things they do in that world are maybe not as, you wonder what they could have done in this world if they'd had a good producer from the beginning, right?
Yeah,
but there's a lot of ideas.
Yeah, we've got to move on. One thing you can give to Bioshock Infinite's credit is you could talk about it for far more than 20 to 30 minutes. I just want to end on one little fun anecdote for it of, I remember this on Twitter, of in the second DLC for...
I know where this is going. Okay, good.
Yeah, the second DLC of Bioshock Infinite was the Burial at Sea, episode 2. It starts in, like, Paris. And someone had tweeted, like, environmental storytelling at its finest. And there's, like, a little boy holding a baguette above his head who's, like, sort of dancing around, right? To let you know, it's France. It's Paris. And the person who worked on that commented that was, like, I was working on this scene and it felt really static. I just had, like, a bunch of chumps standing around that were, like, repeating animation cycles that weren't very exciting. But we had this like animation cycle from when Elizabeth danced in the original game. And I was like, okay, I can use that sort of animation and add some kids. And first it was going to be like 2 kids dancing together, but that ran into its own problems. So it had to be just 1 kid. But, like, I can't remember what else was wrong. It was like, he had to dance like around the different part in the environment, but he was clipping through parts of the environment because of the childness. The size was wrong, so she had to give the child adult hands so that it would work correctly. But then the hands looked really bad because she had to put the boy's hands really far above his head, and they were really big. And so then she added the baguette so that it would look okay. And so that's how you get the dancing French baguette boy.
I'd like to see more developers just sort of pasting a baguette on when something isn't working.
Yeah.
They should get Infinite. I like that people call him Infinite Bread Boy because it sounds like I realize it's Bioshock Infinite Bread Boy, but it implies a sort of endless array of bread boys.
Yeah. Yes.
But they should put some bed bugs on him now.
True. Oh dear.
I think about that a lot. I think about the bed bugs a lot. Anyway, speaking of bugs, Redfall.
Oh, good transition.
Just came to me in the moment, a stroke of brilliance. This multiverse Madelyn doesn't have a joke for the beginning, but she's sure got a segue.
Yeah, she
into
sure
Redfall.
does.
Remind me to talk to you about segues after the show. I won't put it on the readers, but the readers. Yikes! Do you pronounce it seg or segue, readers? There's been a controversy in my orbit. Anyway, Redfall came out in May 2023 of this year. It's an Xbox exclusive from Arcane, published by Bethesda, which is owned by Xbox these days. ZeniMax is owned by Xbox. Arcane of Dishonored, Prey, Deathloop, Acclaim. And yeah, one of our first Bethesda games to be Xbox exclusive here. It's an open world first person shooter. It's got single player and co-op multiplayer modes. You'd think, talk this, co-op multiplayer. That's talk this core right there.
Yeah.
And you're killing some vampires in Massachusetts.
Oh, poor Redfall.
I know, it's quite sad, isn't it?
When they announced it, I was really rooting for it when they announced it. It was one of those ones that got like immediate negative reception for whatever reason. But when I first saw it, I thought it looked cool. But unfortunately, like a Left 4 Dead like.
Yeah.
Which people liked that. That sort of seems to be what they sort of intended for it to be. You've got, right now, 4 playable characters. They say they're adding 2 more. And they have made updates to it, and the DLC is supposed to be coming. I feel like maybe they should just give up. But
I really feel like
that's...
Look, there's so many horrible things about very modern game development here, right? But I feel like every game must be No Man's Sky of it all.
Yeah.
Is especially brutal.
Yeah. Well, before we get into like its recent updates and the reception to that, so you're in Redfall, Massachusetts. There's vampires. You're going around with your friends to kill vampires. And sometimes the vampires move correctly, and sometimes they don't.
They sure take a lot of bullets to kill.
Yeah, and they sure take a lot of bullets to kill. So, Arcane is known for these, like, sort of single-player, immersive sim-like first-person shooters. With the first-person shooter part of that generally being thought of as the weakest aspect of its games, from reviews I've read of, like, Prey and Deathloop and such. So, of course, after Prey did not do so well sale-wise, despite doing well critically, ZeniMax was like, hey guys, so there's this neat new thing happening on the scene right now called, games as service.
Hey guys.
So we'd like you to make sort of like a, a multiplayer title, and like maybe sometimes people can buy some cosmetics,
Hey guys.
And we can like update it, and things like that can happen. And Arcane was like, boy, one, we don't know what we're making. 2, the management doesn't know what we're making. I read there was a big Bloomberg piece again from Jason Schreier.
I'm glad you could read that. I couldn't figure out how to get past the paywall.
It opened on my phone, and then I'd read it before, but in this case, it opened on my phone, and I copied all of it, and I emailed it to myself so I could look it on my computer.
The Internet Archive failed me here. Their archives of the page also did not make it past the paywall.
But basically, initially they said that the lead said we were excited to try it, right? To do something multiplayer and do something new. But then management kept like saying like, oh, we want it to be like Far Cry, or we want it to be like Borderlands, which are
not the
two
same.
Different things. And they couldn't figure out, like, doing the single player and multiplayer design. Apparently they were really understaffed for this sort of production.
Less than 100 people,
which,
right? So
yes, the Austin office was doing this. They have a couple of offices, I think.
an Arcane in France.
But yeah, the Austin office
with baguettes.
is like 100 people. Yes, with the baguettes. Which, like, that's fine for making Prey, but, you know, if you want to compete with, like, all the multiplayer games of service out there right now, that's not enough people, really. You know, and then before or by the end of development, 70% of the staff who had been there during Prey would leave the company because they didn't like working on this project, essentially. And, you know, so an initially low amount became a lower amount with a lot of new people as well, which probably wasn't helpful. And then Microsoft bought ZeniMax for the $7.5 billion, the big deal, the one that wasn't, the one that was fine.
Yeah, the one that was
as
fine.
As opposed to the one that is now fine, apparently.
The one that revealed to us that they want to buy Nintendo.
Yeah. And Arcane was really hoping that Microsoft would come in and say, stop this.
Yeah, just cancel it. Which is
cancel it or start it again.
It's a wild thing for a development team who has already spent like 2-3 years on this to want, right? Because that's like a nightmare scenario a lot of the time, is to get bought and have them say, this thing that you were hoping to be on your resume, no.
Yeah.
But here they wanted it, which is really says a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, they said they either wanted them to just cancel it or let them restart it, like, fully single player, like the games that they normally do. But Microsoft, they hadn't announced it yet, so they canceled the PlayStation version that they'd been working on, but still, like, it was basically the same as before. Microsoft didn't make any changes to anything in particular. And then it came out.
And it was kind of bad.
It was very bad.
Yeah. Buggy.
Not just buggy, but, like, fundamentally not good.
Yeah. No real cutscenes. No, none of some of the, like, default first-person shooter mechanics, like a weapon wheel, aren't there. Flashes of, all the reviews, like, there's flashes of the, like, character development that Arcane is good at here. There's, like, flashes of that. But again, you can see the, like, cut off, pruned away branches of things that they might have been playing around with that didn't get finished for one reason or another. You can see maybe NPCs were meant to have more storyline than they did, or meant to populate in more than they did. Maybe you were meant to have additional safe houses that were something more than, like, 1 or 2 extra fetch quests, right? Not, like, in the, like, other way than Bioshock Infinite, where it's, like, in Bioshock Infinite, it's like, oh, there's a lot of stuff here, and, like, but isn't it neat that this messy thing is here? Here it's like, oh, if only some of that other stuff was here.
Yeah. They didn't actually, like, their initial thing, like I said, had monetization, and they didn't cut that until, like, 2021. Because games as a service was no longer really beloved. Was it ever? At some point.
Briefly.
Yeah.
It also came out locked to 30 FPS, which, look, as we all know, I can't see FPS. But only, like, last week did they give the gamers what they were craving and release a performance mode.
Yeah. The update added, like, a new main quest, the 60 FPS update, which works fine, apparently. The frames are fine. And added some, like, basic stuff, like you can stealth kill enemies now.
Which is, that should say a lot.
And they also increased like map density, which the review I read of the new stuff was like, that's sort of a mixed bag because the enemies still sort of suck. So it's not like I'm running through an empty city anymore. Instead, I'm just wasting tons of bullets on this random pack of vampires I saw on my way to a mission.
It also forces you to stay friends with your friends because only the host moves story progress forward. So if I'm playing with Emma and then I'm like, well, like, I'm going to play a little on my own, the game's like, nope, you're going to play this again.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just so many, like, little things. That's, I mean, obviously they just wanted to get it out the door and be done with it. They were sick of it and they had, you know, they had to release it. But just, like, how did this happen? How did you not do this?
Yeah. Yeah, the one review I read of the update was like, you know, like Cyberpunk managed to pull it back around because there was like interesting systems under there, right? And the review I read on Forbes was just like, there aren't interesting systems under Redfall. You know, like, it's not going to come back in the public's favor. It's simply not. But they do have DLC that they've promised at this point. So we'll see if they end up releasing that and how that goes. But the release of Redfall was really interesting for how, like, frank Phil Spencer was about.
Literally everyone at Xbox came out and was like, this was my, like, bowed their heads to the ground for us and was like, this was my fault. Like, cut off my pinky.
Yeah. Yeah, because I watched all the, he went on Kind of Funny Games, to talk about it, which I was initially, the host of that show was, like, really, like, oh, Phil, we worship at your feet, and so I was a little worried that it wasn't going to be interesting, but the other two people, I felt like, asked interesting questions for him to answer. He did go a lot into, like, you know, our team, if a team has a creative vision, I want them to try that, even, you know, if it fails, which, like, did they have a creative vision? It seems like their creative vision was begging you to let them not do this anymore. But it was also a lot of, like, he's like, we just didn't engage them. We didn't check on them, like we should have after we bought it.
He blamed COVID a bit, too. He was like, this happened, and immediately everybody went home. And it was that much harder.
But it was also really interesting of, like, this is something that you don't really think about, but games do, like, test how, like, big games like this will test how they'll do before release. They'll have people come in and write mock reviews for them. So they'll play the game and they'll estimate, and based on those mock reviews, they can estimate sort of a score that they might expect when it came out. And apparently, whoever wrote the mock reviews was not doing their job very well. Or something. Because, at least according to Phil, he said it was like 20 points below what they had expected it to be, based on that pre-release research. Which, like, how?
Well, I read a few newsletter pieces from a guy who... the newsletter is called Hit Points, but I can't remember I think that's Matt or something. And he writes this newsletter and also does some mock reviews and has been a real quote unquote reviewer in the past. And you know, and he was talking about, and I'm fascinated. I want to seek out more reading about this because I'm fascinated by what is it like to be a mock reviewer. But it's sort of the reviewing process through another layer of magnifying glass or whatever, distorted mirror, because of course when you're reviewing any game here now, you have to review through the lens of, well, probably these bugs, like 66% of these bugs will be disappeared by the time anyone who's not a reviewer is playing this, right? And mock reviewers have to do that sort of like even one step further of, okay, like I'm playing a pre-release build and like, you know, like a probably going gold build here. So, like, they're not really looking for my feedback about bugs that they're obviously going to fix. And you do wonder how much of that here obscured the Emperor has no clothes of it all. That would be my totally based on nothing hypothesis, is that somehow in whatever these reviewers played, they convinced themselves that there was something interesting underneath if only the guns would stop flashing purple or whatever. And then there just wasn't. Or Phil's lying because he has a particular grudge. He wants to fire his mock reviewer. Which could also,
Maybe.
But that was fascinating to me too. It is this fallacy of games now of like, if it comes out bad, you have to fix it. And it's, good for the No Man's Sky team. Good for, I guess, man, I hope they're all okay. The Cyberpunk team. Certainly good for the bajillion dollars Final Fantasy XIV team. But they've certainly set a precedent here that every game that comes out and is a disappointment has to be fixed, because there's a chance that people could come back to it. And, well, maybe this isn't true. Like, Final Fantasy XIV, they did, like, more or less just say, let's start over, right? But, yeah, there has to be something interesting underneath. And I think that's the unfortunate corporate reality of it, is that everybody's gonna keep butting their heads against the wall of this, like, game that is just, like, 30 people are playing it on Steam. Like, it's not coming back. But also, it's on Game Pass, and the head of publishing at Bethesda, Pete Hines, thinks people will want to play it in 10 years. So this is also the dark side of Game Pass, right? Is that if your game comes out and it's bad, there is still someone betting on it being on a draw on Game Pass, and so, like, you must make it better.
Yeah. And that's, like, what really bums me out about that is I would really rather Arcane be making, like, they don't really make games that I want to play, right? Mostly because they're first-person shooters, and I'm not really, they make me motion sick, as we've already talked about. But they make interesting games, and I would much rather them start on a new game that's interesting and is to their strengths, than have to focus on working on this for the next 10 years. This is so that somebody will play it at some point. It just feels like a waste of the development studio, I guess.
I also want to read part of this quote from head of Xbox Game Studios, Matt Booty, which is, like, first of all,
I love that guy. Just his name. I know nothing about him, but I love him.
Tough childhood you must have had, huh? Just incredible. So he says, when a studio becomes part of Xbox, like it or not, they become part of first party. And as a part of first party, they exist in a different spotlight. People look at them through a different lens. And it's my responsibility, our responsibility as the wider Xbox organization, to make sure they understand that. And then to make sure they're set up and that we set expectations appropriately. If you're a small studio that's independent, you might ship a game, you might be working on something and say, hey, this isn't really working. Let's just ship this thing, get it out of the way, and move on to our next game. We don't have that luxury as part of first party. Which is interesting both in the light of, like, really, dude? What you're saying here is, like, guess what, kids? First party games have got to be good. It's like, okay. Yeah. But also, I think you can read under that your Xbox Game Pass game has to eventually be good.
Yeah.
Which is a little dark.
Yeah. I sort of, Xbox been, despite all their acquisitions, the games that have come out, mostly still from their acquisitions, were ones that were announced prior to acquisition, so they came out on all systems, right? That includes, like, Arcane's Deathloop. Had been announced prior to acquisition, and so it came out on all systems, even though it's technically a Xbox Studios game, right? And they just, like, this and, like, Starfield are, like, the first ones that are Xbox exclusive from that like $7.5 billion deal that they made. And they have all of these other companies like, Hellblade 2 is coming out at some point. Compulsion Games just announced their next game, which I think looks neat in aesthetic, although we'll see what the gameplay is because they haven't showed anything from that yet. That doesn't really bother me when they announce CG trailers like it does some people for what it's worth.
Over there like,
but,
where's the gameplay? Give me some gameplay.
And all this other stuff, like they're just now like getting their companies to make them games and that actually come out on Xbox. So something like this is from like, the overarching business sense is very bad for them, right? When one of their first like exclusives from all these purchases is tanking critically and commercially, right? They don't want that. So I get it from that perspective, even if it is deeply dystopian that they can just buy everything, Anyway, Sony might be heading into a drought soon too, so
all they have to do is Final Fantasy VII PS6.
They don't. It comes out on PlayStation first. This was actually very hilariously one of the justifications why the Microsoft buying of it's Bethesda, right? That was in courts.
Yeah. No, Activision.
No, Activision. I'm sorry. For the Activision one was because Sony has things like Final Fantasy 16, even though that's not, they do not own Square Enix. So they just have like a year-long deal with them, like they can be on it for a year and then they can put it on other systems. Yeah. But I meant like the Naughty Dog situation.
Yeah.
They just fired a ton of their QA staff. That multiplayer project they've been working on for years is like stalled, and apparently they're going to release The Last Part 2 remastered. So they're using their talents wisely, I guess. /S.
They're probably working on Crash Bash too.
We can only dream and hope. The Naughty Dog, the Crash Bash company.
They did make Crash Bash.
Yeah.
That's really what I want from them. Crash Bash remastered.
That's fair. It's fair.
Oh, whatever, man. They've got money to make. It's a shame, but like, what can I say? They'll make money on that. They'll release it with the second season of the television show. I hope it's an easy job. I hope those developers deserve a easy job.
They just had, well, I don't know how, apparently the PC port of part 1 was not that easy, so. Well, shall we mash?
I just want to call out that we literally said in this episode, like, oh, it's so hard when someone comes in and expects you to take two totally different ideas, and, like, make a game.
The issue, I think, with Borderlands and Far Cry is, like, they're different, but also similar.
Oh, interesting.
So that's when we're hitting, like, the time when, like, there's a little too much overlap, but also they're very different games.
I think we've got a little bit of that going on here, too. I don't know. We have to have some kind of allegory, but this time it involves vampires. I think.
You're right. Vampires have never, ever been used for anything allegorical, ever in their entire history.
That's right.
So
they're just monsters. Look, I'm not saying you're right. I need something, but like I feel like you could start there and then you have to make something. The problem with this mashup is that I have to come up with some kind of very fully realized alternate history. Let's pick a good historical event. Like some semi-obscure,
a good one.
Semi-obscure. It doesn't have to be a positive one. A semi-obscure, but we've heard of it, historical event.
That's asking a lot from me, Madelyn.
You took both European and American history.
Yeah, that was like...
I know.
11 years ago.
You don't have to remember that much about it. I'm asking you as someone who took both of those, like, pull out a nice historical event for us here.
I've got
Oh,
nothing.
man.
It's got to have to do with vampires too, you know?
Well, we'll figure out the vampires. I'm thinking, what's a good history? Like, Boxer Rebellion is so good. That's such a deep cut. It's not a deep cut. It's an important moment in, like, Asian and American history. But, like,
Yeah.
also excellent. Let's see. I feel like it can't be American history. I mean, maybe it has to be, though. Maybe I have to stick with the American history.
They're both very American, you know, the Northeast and
You're right. You know, what, like Mexican-American War?
I don't
like
know.
the War of 1812.
Sure, the War of 1812.
The, like,
great one.
I'm still thinking. So trying to come up with like a good vampire allegory for me. I'm trying to come up with like good American history things.
I mean, the most common one for vampires is like, you know, LGBTQ stuff.
Okay, I'm gonna have to. I know that LGBTQ people existed before this, but I think if the vampires are gonna be LGBTQ, we might have to bump it a little further forward in history.
What's the, isn't there one of the early presidents that is like, everybody is like, maybe he was gay?
I'm gonna look it up. Which presidents?
One of the little lesser known ones.
James Buchanan, The Bachelor.
Yeah. Yes.
Oh, we could do like a teapot dome
I think it was
scandal
James Buchanan.
situation. But really it was okay. That's like 1920s. So we could have flappers, you know?
Roaring 20 is always fun.
Roaring 20s is fun,
always
but
fun.
we're going to make it boring politics. So, yeah. So for those who don't know, this is good. This is actually good. So the Teapot Dome scandal, to quote the History Channel, shocked Americans by revealing an unprecedented level of greed and corruption within the federal government.
Like they're vampires.
Yeah, everyone is a vampire.
Sucking your blood.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't like that we got here from which president is the one that we think is
This
gay.
actually does not have to do with
And
that.
also
James
he's
Buchanan
power
was
hungry.
not the Teapot Dome scandal. I was thinking of a different scandal, which
Okay.
I don't think was
Okay.
James Buchanan either. But in case anyone was wondering, James Buchanan, famous bachelor president, rumored to be gay. I think Pete Buttigieg thinks that he was gay. Google suggests. Anyway, yes. The Teapot Dome scandal, this is American History Podcast now, sorry everybody, involved the Secretary of Interior who was accepting bribes from oil companies. Could be blood banks in this one, just saying. In exchange for the rights to drill oil on federal land. So it was a pay-to-play thing. And Warren Harding, famously bad president, kind of let it happen. Tipped the scales in favor of them.
All right, so a deeply political game about the Teapot Dome scandal that is also inexplicably a first-person shooter.
There are
Okay.
guns.
I think that is really captured in the spirit
I do
here.
too. Also, it's a multiplayer experience.
Yeah, yes. With your friends.
Yeah. I think if
And they're
there had
vampires.
been vampires involved in the Teapot Dome scandal, it would have been that much more interesting.
Yeah. I love it.
Like, it can be
Definitely
a
a highlight.
twist. You think the whole time it's like oil, but then you get there and you realize the oil was actually a cover-up, that they're like, well, we want to get really political.
That's a very strong visual of, like, rather than oil, like the blood of the earth,
Yeah.
right? Like spouting out, like sort of metaphorically.
Well, and I think
for the death of the planet.
This is not something,
you might say.
if we're going to get into the, like, racism is bad kind of element of Bioshock Infinite, there could certainly be what we're really leasing isn't these lands of oil. What we're really leasing is these lands for the vampires to feed on, like, the residents. That would be the twist.
Okay, but I really want the blood of the earth to spurt out of the ground.
I think that's great.
To be fair.
I think that's excellent.
Okay.
Of course, though, the development... Sorry, it's going to take us, 7 years to do this game. And none of this will be in the final. We'll have picked a different historical event.
Yes.
It'll be about Watergate by the time we're done.
All right. Do you want to sign us out?
Listeners, thanks for tuning in to an American history episode of Talk This.
It's dangerous to podcast alone.
If you enjoyed the show, you should follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube at Talk This Podcast. You can also visit our website, www.talkthispodcast.com, where you can read all about the show, check out the games in the hat, and read our blog, featuring long-running series, Click My Boyfriend, and Split Screen. And hey, maybe we'll write an explainer of the Teapot Dome scandal. Just for you. So you're prepared for our upcoming game, Blood of the Earth, or whatever. But finally, and perhaps most importantly, if you enjoy the show, you should subscribe. We're on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts until they become something else, TuneIn, Spotify, Pandora Podcasts online and on the app, Overcast, Pocket Casts, wherever you can find podcasts. Subscribe to Talk This. Listen every week. Next week, it's Emma's side quest.
Yep. I'll have a topic.
You sure will.
I will.
But what will we be talking about in 2 weeks? Something spooky, I hope.
Sure. For our old game, we'll be talking about Star Ocean.
Spooky.
Space. You know?
Space. A lot of space games lately.
Yeah. And for our new game, we'll be talking about A Space for the Unbound.
Space.
Different kind of space.
Still says space.
But space. Still says space.
So look forward to that. Look forward to Emma's side quest next week. And then it'll be November. Crazy. So listeners, that's it for this week's show. Emma, do you have a good... Send them off with a history factoid. Come on. I know you've got one.
This week, I hope you don't get defenestrated in Prague.
It's a good one.